everyone, my name is Laura and I am the marketing person at Open Book Publishers, and I am delighted to say that we have with here today the author Leslie Howsam, that is the person in charge of a new publication, Eliza Orme's Ambitions, Politics and the Law in Victorian London. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here, Leslie. Thank you so much. And yes,
so wonderful to be here, Laura.
My pleasure. Yeah, so what we're going to do today, we're going to have a discussion about this new title, and just to briefly introduce the audience to the title, what Leslie does in this book is an account made to uncover Orme's professional and personal trajectory, that we feel that it will especially appeal to academics and non-academic readers, but also those interested in progress and setbacks of women in the area in the late Victorian era and the Edwardian decades as well. Eliza Orme, as you will briefly introduce in a second, is a very interesting figure, very multifaceted figure, that is a very good example of what was being a woman at that time and having that trajectory within the society of the late Victorian period. So without further ado, and if that's okay, I will continue with my first question. So as I was saying before, your book presents Eliza Orme as not a singular person that has just one perspective to her. She was very multifaceted. She was involved in law, politics, and various social causes. So I was wondering, despite everything that she had going on in her time, what was the element that drew you to Eliza Orme?
Well, I came across Eliza Orme a long time ago. That's the first thing to say. So in a way, it's hard to tell you what drew me to her, but it was back when I was beginning to study modern British history as a graduate student in the 1980s. And what I noticed was the initials LLB for a law degree after her name. So historians then, and still now, were very interested in social class. But back in those days, historians were just beginning to work on gender as a concept and to women as historical subjects. So I think, to answer your question, really, what drew me was curiosity. What was a woman with a law degree doing in 1880s London? The particular context was that she was helping George Gissing, the novelist, with some practical, difficult issues in his life to do with his marriage breaking down and whatnot. So like lots of people could be helping him, other people were, but why this law degree? So she was kind of a footnote to Gissing's story. And what I've been trying to do with this book is kind of make people like him a footnote to her story, to use her contacts with people that were well known to put her in the center and others, as it were, in the periphery. What I didn't realize back then that I do now, I think, is that Orme is in a sense easier to understand in our time, in the late 20th century and the early 21st, than she was for people in her own time, in the late 19th, early 20th. Most of the noteworthy women of that time, apart from the novelists and poets, were women who wanted to create change on behalf of other people, right? They were reformers. They wanted to create change on behalf of other women. So in terms of the right to vote, Millicent Fawcett and lots of others, in terms of medical care for women patients, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, to prevent prostitutes from being exploited, Josephine Butler, to improve the conditions of workhouses, Louisa Twining. I could go on and on and on. But the thing is that she was just a little bit different from that. She wanted something for herself. She did want to help other women become lawyers, but the ambition, and that's why it's in the title of my book, is for herself. First of all, to become a lawyer. And as I try to say in the book, I don't know for certain because the evidence isn't there, but it's possible that she had even greater ambitions to become a politician herself, and perhaps even a member of parliament in her own right. So I think I was drawn, to answer your question properly, I think I was drawn by that ambition, even though I didn't really start identifying it until much later.
Thank you so much. One of the things that you mentioned now is Eliza was very much a footnote to many big names in history. And that's something I'm very interested in, because you highlight throughout the book the various challenges that she faced in the male-dominated area, especially in the legal and political spheres. So I was wondering if you could let us know a little bit more about what were the most significant obstacles that she found and how she managed to navigate that landscape at that time.
Right. Well, as you say, the biggest obstacle was the way the legal professions were set up. And I say professions plural because there were different routes to becoming a barrister and a solicitor, but both of those were structured in a way to make it impossible for women to apply, and therefore absolutely impossible for women ever to practice. And, I could talk for a long time, but it would be very boring about exactly how that worked, because it was a very kind of archaic structure. So I'll just, ask you to take that on my word. So first, she tried in a very polite and roundabout way to start out as a sort of apprentice to a barrister. But the Inns of Court and the Law Society continued to reject the idea of her going any further than just sitting there on the outside. And then she found that she could make money by working for properly credentialed lawyers, for male lawyers, preparing complex property documents that they would sign, they would be paid for, but then they would turn over half that fee to her since she had actually done the work. So she set up her own office in Chancery Lane, which was and still is the legal district of London, to do that kind of work, and other things like being a patent agent that were not so stringently regulated. So it's deeply unfair. She had the law degree, but that didn't actually have anything to do with becoming a lawyer. But on the other hand, she managed to make a very good living. She had a legal partner working with her, another person who also had a law degree. They hired some staff to support their enterprise. So she was making a living by practicing law in a sort of a way, in an unofficial way. So that's the legal obstacle. In terms of the political obstacles, she was a member of a party, the Liberal Party. And the obstacle, which was a big deal in those days, right? You may know the name of William Gladstone, like he was, the Liberals and the Tories were the two big parties. She was a member of the Liberal Party, and the obstacle there was that women's participation was limited to the Ladies' Auxiliary, which was called the Women's Liberal Federation. And she used that. She used that to teach women skills in public speaking. She was a formidable public speaker herself, and she actually sort of set up classes to help young women learn how to do that. Skills in organization, same kind of thing. She set up a newspaper to support local political activity by women. But when it came to, the real stuff of politics, the conversations, the meetings on policy, I don't think she was ever included. If she ever was included, I've never found any evidence of that. So I think she was probably kept on the sidelines of that, the stuff that she found, the most interesting. So she navigated the obstacles by working around them, as it were, in creative ways.
Thank you very much. That actually takes me to my next question, this idea of she being around the circles but never in the circle. So one of the things that you mentioned is her role in the Women's Liberal Federation. And throughout your book, you also deal with the fact that she had internal conflicts within that circle with other activists. So could you discuss a little bit the complexities of her relationship with the movement in itself and how that shaped her legacy as a whole?
Okay, let me start by being the professor a little bit and kind of reminding you that the Victorian women's movement was something that has its own history. And the short version is that in the early years, say the 1860s and 1870s, they were more optimistic. And that's the period when we talk about the moderate suffragist movement for women's votes, women's suffrage. Whereas later on into the 1910s, when we hear about the suffragettes and the violent activities, the militant activities of those people, that was 40, 50 years later, a lot had changed and people were more frustrated, more angry. Her career kind of sits on the earlier end of that trajectory. but the longer version of the story is more complicated. Not only years and decades and generations went into the struggle, um, and of course, it was not just for the vote, but also for employment opportunities and for various social reforms. The complication in Eliza Orme's case is that she was a liberal in her politics, but a lot of powerful liberals opposed women's suffrage as a matter of party policy. Some of them may have privately supported it, but they thought it wouldn't get them elected. So it was very much a kind of inside politics kind of thing, that they figured that, you know, votes for women might be an advantage to the Tories, that sort of thing. Others were more intransigently anti-women, but, you know, it was a complicated thing. So the Women's Liberal Federation, of course, this was a difficulty for them. They supported the party, but many in the party didn't support women's suffrage. And they actually broke up. They had a split in the 1890s over this issue. One side wanted to insist that male politicians of their party had to declare their views on the cause. The other side, and this is the one that Eliza Orme belonged to, disagreed with that as a strategy. They thought it would be bad for other important issues that the party cared about, and that anyway, they didn't think it would work. So she wasn't anti-suffrage, but she was opposed to this extreme pro-suffrage faction within her party. That's the complication. And at this point in time, it's not so much a matter of which side was right. In a sense, both sides were right, although for different reasons. But it's more a matter of the effect that it had on her later reputation. In the sense, she was on the losing side of this little dispute. The people on the winning side didn't win all that much, but, you know, if you want to say that women's history is written by the winners, they were the winners. And so when historians came along later in the 1970s and 80s and 90s and started to write those stories, it was the other side's stories that they were seeing, that they were finding in the record books. So I think that's, you know, it's complicated and messy. It was a tiny little dispute in some ways, but it had ramifications. Some people read it the wrong way. I read it the wrong way for a long time when I was first trying to understand this, but I think I've got hold of it now.
So it was more of a strategic movement, so to say.
That's right. And strategic is a very important word as far as she's concerned. I think she was a pretty good strategist, but she couldn't always convince the other women in the Federation to go along with her strategies. And part of that was because of the law degree, because she had sort of learned to think in a certain way as a law student. And, you know, they were just not lawyers, as we all know.
Different.
There's a difference there.
That's very interesting. It's quite surprising to see how that could be misread afterwards, yes. But at the same time, it's very understandable to see in the whole context of her time and why she was doing it. So yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, just talking about the position that she had and like how she was very much moving around liminal spaces between different areas. So one of the things that I was surprised about is that, as you mentioned in the book as well, she's quite an obscure figure in some way. Like not a lot of people have that knowledge of her as they might have another figure. So I was wondering if you could sort of like discuss with us, why do you think that she has that sort of speak lesser status, or why is her story has been hit? Why her story has been hidden so far or not so promoted, and why do you think right now is significant, and why her legacy should be brought up at a time like this?
Right. Well, I mean, apart from what, you know, the little business about the Women's Liberal Federation and their split, I think the bigger reason is that it was just almost unthinkable for a woman to be a lawyer. They just couldn't get their minds around that idea. You know, there's a book called An Unsuitable Job for a Woman, and some people thought it was unsuitable, but it was really more than unsuitable. It was like they just could not imagine that a woman could be a lawyer. The whole idea of a woman lawyer was a running joke in that culture. And yet there she was. She had a law degree. She had a public career. but the career still didn't quite add up to an identity as a lawyer. They weren't quite sure what it was, but it couldn't be that, so it wasn't that. She did all these other things apart from the legal services work in London that I talked about a minute ago. She was on a royal commission on labor and another government investigation of prison conditions. And she got invited to do those jobs because she had the law degree and the experience. But I think she still didn't quite fit anybody's stereotypes. She was good at what she did, so she got to do it, but it still didn't fit ideas of what a lawyer should be doing or what an educated woman should be doing. So I think that's what explains the relative obscurity, that and the fact that she lived quite a long time. She lived to be 88 years old, so that when she died, a lot of the people who had known her were already gone. So that's just, you know, one of those coincidences, one of those things that happened. If she'd happened to die, you know, 20 years earlier, then people would have remembered her, and there would have been obituaries in the press and that kind of thing. So it wasn't really until the period around 2019, or the period leading up to 2019, which was the anniversary of 1919, when women finally were allowed to be lawyers, that a lot of people started to take an interest. Women lawyers and historians of women lawyers started to say, "Oh, okay, how did this all work out? And who was this person? And where does she fit in?"
Thank you so much. So one really interesting thing about the way your book has been created and is done is that it is what you describe as a research memoir. So that intertwines your own journey with Elizabeth Orme's narrative. And I was wondering how your personal experience and how your evolving perspective on the topic influenced your interpretation of her life and legacy.
Well, I think the starting point is that there's just so little evidence about this person, historical evidence. There's so little on the record of what her life is, that I think I have had to speculate about things that I don't know for sure. I've already mentioned my sort of big speculation that she might have hoped to become one of the first members of parliament. But a smaller example is that I happen to know that she had a job as a science teacher before she went to law school. But I only know that because she happened to be working in this other place and calling herself a science teacher when the census happened in what was it, 1871. So I don't know why she was a science teacher. I don't know what made her change to law. So I have to speculate about things that where there's a little bit of evidence, but it's not clear what she was really thinking. Now, I'm a professional historian, which means I can't make things up, but professional historians are allowed to speculate within a sort of a range of what is possible based on what else I know about her as a person and what else I know about the period and what all was going on. But I figure if it's my speculations, then I owe my readers a bit of an explanation of where I'm coming from so that they can make a judgment as to whether they agree with me or not. One of the ways I had thought about this is to think in terms of comparing sort of two 30-year periods. Say from 1874, when she decided to try for a career in law, to 1904, when she was more or less retired from public life, and she happened to do a kind of interview in 1904 where there's that's a little bit of the evidence. So there's 30 years of her life, which is more or less what the book is about. For me, say from 1990, when I was still working on my PhD and trying to decide what I was going to do about this sort of side project on Eliza Orme, to 2020, when, first of all, I was retired from teaching, but also looking for a pandemic research project. So it kind of it fits in, her life fits into my life in this kind of jigsaw way. there's been so much change in the last 30 years for me as a researcher, coming back to this challenge of an interesting person who had apparently left no personal papers, or so I thought back in the 80s. No evidence except the fact of the academic degree and some books and articles she had written. So then I came back to a digital research environment. And when I started working on her, I did find some personal papers, a few letters that she had written to a friend, and a whole volume of the newspaper she edited. And those made a tremendous difference to the story that I could tell.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's very interesting to see how you have decided to set on a period of years, just to see how that evolution on her side could apply to your own evolution. That's very fascinating. So yeah, one of the things I think it's one of the ongoing topics with Eliza, which is really interesting because it's not just a one size fits all character, is that you have encountered various depictions of Eliza. So people have talked about her character, saying like she has some malignant skimmer, but she's also a quick-witted champion. You have a lot of sort of like ideas that clash with each other. So I was wondering, how do you reconcile these contrasting views, and what do you think they reveal about the challenge of studying women in positions of influence at that time?
Yeah. Well, of course, anybody involved in public affairs is going to attract both support and opposition. But I think because she was doing something so extraordinary, both the admirers and the detractors were going to be more extreme. Here's a story I can tell you from quite early in her career that maybe shows the kind of thing she was up against. And it's a little bit funny and also appalling as well. So I found a file of letters in University College London archives, and this was way back when. I didn't have to find this on the internet. And so the file of letters was this objection that had been raised. A man called Pascoe Daphne, a law student, objected that Miss Orme had won an important scholarship, a 3-year award for studying jurisprudence. Now, this is where the funny part comes in, because he had actually missed the exam. So the first thing he was saying was, "Can I write it anyway, please?" But his further objection was that he had not seen Miss Orme at lectures. So obviously, he said, she shouldn't have won the scholarship. Fortunately, there's a letter in that file from her too, where she explains that she was at lectures, that she may have arrived late on some occasions, so perhaps didn't get to sign the register or whatever they had. But she had in fact been in class. And there's also letters from the professors confirming that she did win the scholarship. But that's just a tiny example. There happens to be a record of, I think that's the kind of thing she was up against. So that man, Pascoe Daphne's view of her character was obviously that she was a malignant schemer. But he and men like him were also, I think, worried about the competition that she and eventually other women in the profession might offer to the male students if the male students lost that advantage. So, there's always that in the background too. As long as women aren't able to be law students, that reduces the possibility that they might turn out to be just as good as men, or God forbid, better than men at what they're doing.
Well, thank you so much. That is absolutely fascinating, how seeing how even small things like that, like classmates just trying to go against her. That's incredible. I guess it shouldn't come as a surprise, but it's still quite incredible to see those stories recorded. So so just generally to sort of like just give that final push to the readers to go and access these open access book. I was wondering, as a historian, what lessons do you hope they get from this book, and how do you think the experiences of Eliza can help shed light on how different roles, like gender roles, power roles, and the concept of ambition as well was in the Victorian society?
Yeah, okay. Well, let's focus on the ambition part of it. I mentioned earlier that her particular ambition, as compared to other women reformers of her time, might be identified as selfish, or at least not as purely altruistic as others might have been or seen themselves. When she wrote to Helen Taylor in 1872 to say, I want to study law and I'd like help from you and your stepfather, who was John Stuart Mill, this is what she said. She said she wanted to study law for two reasons, quote, because I see work to be done in explaining to women their real position from the legal point of view. And number two, because it is a lucrative profession which ought to be open to women. So that was perfectly legitimate and fair enough, and certainly ambitious enough. And it was also altruistic, as I say. It would help women to, as clients, to have a woman lawyer in some cases, or so she argued. But I think she also saw something else for herself, that a third reason to study law would be to set herself up to enter politics on the same basis as men. I think it was reasonable to think that it would be possible that women would secure the right to vote not long after. I mean, who knew in the 1860s when they started talking about it that it was going to take until 1919? They were more optimistic than that. So if you're optimistic and you're young and you think that pretty soon women are going to have the vote, and then after that it'll only be a matter of time before women can be elected to Parliament, then it seems to me that that's a reasonable ambition to have, and going to law school seems, and trying to practice law seems like a good way to get to it. She did other things too that aspiring politicians did, like she did a lot of journalism, and again, that's something that a lot of aspiring politicians did, kind of make a public name for themselves by writing articles in the press. So as I say, in 1872, she could hardly guess that it was going to take till 1919 before the vote even happened, or women could be lawyers. So you know, she was optimistic in those earlier years. Obviously, it didn't work out the way she hoped, but what I'm trying to do is kind of go back to that early point where the ambition seemed reasonable, and then go forward from there to what actually happened, which wasn't the first woman member of Parliament or the first woman barrister, but was still, I think, quite a remarkable career.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Well, to everyone who is watching, I must say, please dive into this fascinating book written by no one else but Leslie Howsam. Leslie said, like, she's fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and she's the Emeritus Distinguished Professor at the University of Windsor. So who best to tell you the story of Eliza? So yeah, this is an open access title that will be available for everyone to read everywhere. So please to access it, download it, buy it. It's also in hardback and EPUB edition. So please go ahead and just get your copy. Leslie, it's an absolute pleasure to have been able to interview. It's absolutely fascinating to know Eliza's life from the first hand from this conversation. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. And I must say, it's been great working with Open Book Publishers, and I'm very happy that the book is going to be freely available in PDF form, but also that I'll be able to have copies on my shelf and give copies to my friends. It is
an absolute pleasure. And yes, so yeah, everyone click on the link on the description box and you will access Eliza's life story. Thank you so much, Leslie.